The first speaker I'd like to introduce is Jennifer Harris, she's been lecturing and tutoring in Asian art history at the University of Adelaide for the last 10 years. It's a course that is done very closely in conjunction with the Art Gallery of South Australia and quite unique. Her PhD dissertation has examined the formation of the Art Gallery of South Australia's collection of Japanese art. Now, I'll just add here, for those who don't know, that Adelaide in the late 19th century was said to have among the highest standard of living of any Western country or any country of the Western diaspora. And it also, it had only been established about 60 years. Before that, the Adelaide Plains were the inhabitants of the Kaurna people. And in that 60 years, it established a coterie of connoisseurs and collectors of Japanese art, which was quite unique in Australia. And Jennifer's going to talk about their work and how they established the foundation of the gallery's collection. Jennifer's other works and curations have been her research on our Netsuke collection, and she published Netsuke and Other Miniatures from the Japanese collection of the Art Gallery of South Australia in 2014, and her current display, The Power of Pattern, from the Mitsui collection, textiles from the Mitsui collection, is currently on at the Art Gallery. So, Jennifer, if you'd like to begin today's proceedings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you just make sure I've got the right. My sound's okay up the back there? Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much, and I'm going to continue a somewhat parochial tone that James has started in terms of the formation of the collections. I'm looking at how they were formed not only in South Australia, because I obviously was interested in the comparisons, what else was happening around Australia and New Zealand. In fact, it also goes into the world, but we've only got 20 minutes. So I'm going to start off with South Australia and in that order end up with New South Wales. And I've kind of divided them into the three main factors that contributed to the formation of collections. Benefaction being a major reason for the collections, looking at curatorial acumen and external factors or just happenstance that no one really appreciated at the time. South Australia started off, actually, the Art Gallery of South Australia was the richest art gallery in 1897. It opened in 1880, 1881. 1897 it acquired £25,000 from the Thomas Elder collection. Thomas Elder bequest. However, he stipulated, and this is very much that 19th century view of art, that the money was to be spent on pictures only. So you can see the dominance there of fine art as we know it, and it's not until 1904 that Morgan Thomas' bequest comes along, and another significant amount of money, and it enabled the gallery to start going into the decorative arts. And so one of the messages that goes through my talk is that that's where Japanese art finds itself, within the applied or the decorative arts. And so at that time, using the bequest fund, an agent in Britain was appointed to make a historical collection of ceramics, but it did include glass as well, and across the world. So largely it was British European ceramics, but there were 35 Japanese pieces, and oddly, and from my viewpoint, I suppose, 70, so double the number of Chinese, but the Chinese drops off thereafter. So 1904 is the key year. The collection of Japanese is pretty middling to some degree. There are some nice pieces which I've included, and there are some little surprises that I investigated, like the little tea bowl that's used for sencha. You can see there is signed by Seifu Yohei. So generally the pieces are going to be of the Meiji era, contemporary pieces at the time. I think because the collection was not all that flash, H.P. Gill, who was the honorary curator at the time, almost ironically, because there'd been £3,000 spent on purchasing this collection in Britain, he then turned to the dealer in Melbourne Frank E. Godden, and bought these 2 pieces of croissonné. There were no croissonné included in the original purchase. And in a way, to me, they are amongst the best pieces, but acquired from within Australia, oddly enough. And so Namikawa Yasuyuki, for those of you that know croissonné, is a highly valued croissonné maker, and he was at the time. And Hayashi Kodenji. So both of those are marked pieces that we've put on display. Things go quietly until 1914, when we acquire another bequest. So the benefaction is largely not donations at the time, but bequests. And we have William Milne, who had been collecting back in the 1880s. We're not quite sure where, because he frequently went to Britain. He also was a commissioner for South Australia at the 1880 Melbourne exhibition, international exhibition. So exhibitions form a strong line through the formation of collections as well. From him we acquire our very first okimono and netsuke, and as well as some really beautiful bronzes, but time being what it is, I just have to select a couple. Then a major force in the Art Gallery of South Australia is Sir Samuel Way. He basically was Mr. Adelaide. He was for 40 years the Chief Justice. He was President of the Art Gallery and Library and Museum. He was involved with the zoo. He's one of those 19th century Renaissance men that were into everything. But he was a collector as well. And it's interesting to examine how he collected. Now, in 1879 and 1880, he was also a commissioner in South Australia for the international exhibitions, and so we've got a piece on display at the moment by Kodansha. And Kodansha, in 1879, one of their first exhibitions in the world was the Sydney. So we certainly, through his diaries, he collected, went in and purchased pieces from the exhibition. And this is one of them that I can date to 1879. I've put this in. Clearly it's not Japanese, but it's to remind me that the whole ambience at the time is, of course, the arts and crafts movement. So I feel sort of at one with the building we're in today. Japonisme, Art Nouveau, all of those art movements that were whirling around in Europe were obviously flowing through to collectors like Sir Samuel Way, and so of the non-Western art that he's collecting, Japanese art by way certainly dominates his thought processes, and you can understand why, given the environment. He also did collect, not only exclusively, but he collected other areas as well, and on his travels overseas, he visits India and the Holy Lands as he describes them, and he makes some purchases. So there's Tibetan and Persian pieces coming through, but the majority of the collections from these people at the time is Japanese. Way is kind of unique because he actually travels to Japan, and he is informed, so his curatorial knowledge is informed by books that are being published in great quantities due to the interest in Japan. He buys Murray's Handbook for Traveller's Guide to Japan. He signs it in December 1891 when he arrives in Yokohama. I've opened this page, Ikeda, lacquer, bronzes, crockery, and he heads off to Ikeda. He mentions that as you go through his documentation. And Ikeda is the agent for the Kamiya Company. So he purchases this very large and very beautiful shakudo plaque, and he goes off to other shops around town according to the book that he's got. It's his handbook. So he's got no formal knowledge or education. This is a completely new field of collecting, and this is how he responded to it. He goes off to Nagasaki, Kyoto. He's shopping. He's basically like a vacuum cleaner, sucking up items at wherever shops he goes to. Of course, there's the Zuba. So you can find these across lots of collections that start entering not only South Australia but all the other colonies at the time, or states. The articulated bronzes were very popular. They were something odd and kind of bizarre about them that was very appealing, and in a way they become ubiquitous, so that when Louis Gans publishes one of the earliest books on l'art japonais, he features the articulated crab. So that sets a standard. Everyone's out to get one because Louis Gans puts it there. Another collector that I'll mention in a minute in New Zealand, he's also got an articulated crab. So you start to see objects being repeated around the traps. Now here's the sort of happenstance, I suppose, of Sir Samuel Way. He really didn't know what he was buying. He was well-intentioned, and he went into a curio shop and buys this Buddhist statue. He's very interested in religions. He's a great book collector, and in fact his book collection becomes the beginnings of the Bar Smith Library at Adelaide University. And woe and behold, it is from the Kamakura period, and I've put the note there that he probably bought it in a curio shop because at the time Buddhism was on the nose in Japan because of the Destroy Buddhism, the Haibutsu Kishaku movement, which had been going on for some period. So the temples were being emptied out. And then when Meiji comes along, the Shinbutsu Bunri, the separation of Shintoism and Buddhism. So Buddhism, it's a great time to be in Japan buying Buddhist wares, and so we benefit from that. But he had no idea, truly, at the time. Further on, another man who's actually living in Japan, and as far as I can track down, he's the only Oyatoi Guy Kokujin who's employed by the Meiji government and part of the modernisation, who actually, from whom a gallery acquires objects. A lot of them go from Australia, work in Japan, come home, and then they're left with the family, and they never come into the gallery. So he dies in 1923. The objects were acquired during the time, 1876 to 1880, that John Daniel Custance was working in the Agricultural College at Comaba. He comes out to Adelaide to become the inaugural director of the Roseworthy Agricultural College, and has brought with him his collection, which doesn't come to us, and in fact it's sold to us, so it's not a bequest at all, for an amazingly small amount of money, and so we get our first prints. So up to now it's been entirely the applied arts that we've acquired, and that one Buddhist work that I've mentioned. So prints, which if you look at the pattern of collecting in France and Europe, it's prints where they start from. But in Australia we're following the British model, the British taste, which is the applied arts, trying to get pieces that inform our own industrial design. We're kind of what I call into industrial espionage to a degree. So his print collection is largely Hiroshige, and there are a few, unusually, Yokohama-e, which I've included here. But the absolute gem, which is purchased amongst other objects for the total of £5, is this amazing emakimono. And so this is another area that I find no evidence of being collected. Ainu and Ryukyuan or Okinawan works don't seem to be appearing. So when we're collecting in Australia, it's purely that mainstream Japanese, but read that as mainly Meiji-era works that are coming through. So this emakimono sat for 60 years, unloved, unrecognised, until someone looked at it in the year 2000, and we realised that we had a real humdinger on our hands, and it was actually on display in James's recent treasure ships that's already been mentioned. So this, I believe, is one of 3 works depicting the Ainu outside of Japan. So a little contingent from the National History Museum came down and photographed it, and I believe it's on digitally. It can be seen in Sakura at the museum there nowadays. So pure chance, and happenstance is the thing. I'm not making a big deal of Mrs. Charles Rasp, who was married to Charles Rasp was the founder of BHP Billiton, a very wealthy family, likewise travelled off to Japan, and we get from her much later down the track, we think possibly purchased at the 1888 Melbourne International Exhibition, but it's to me a fabulous example of high Meiji, that hybrid art that's been created deliberately for the Western market, and this is what we're happily collecting. Of course it all goes a bit sour further down the track when the curatorial knowledge starts up and we have a sense of what Japanese art is about, and we actually start to reject these pieces, unfortunately, because I love Meiji art, and of course it's being rediscovered nowadays. Likewise, for benefaction, we go into the NGV, the National Gallery of Victoria, and it outdoes us in 1904 when it receives the Felton bequest, £378,000. And the NGV, of course, is the oldest museum in Australia, opening in 1861. It begins to collect Japanese in 1868 when it purchases some bronzeware, again the applied arts, for £40 in Britain. But when they get the Felton bequest, they actually put money with international curators, I suppose we'd call them now. For example, Jean-Jacques Marquet de Vasselot, £1,000, and he goes out and he buys for them this screen. Now, I'm sorry about a lot of the photos, because actually a lot of these works are not sort of in the public domain and being terribly well photographed. So I've had to scan and whatever else to get the images. And so this is an amazing purchase. It's the first fine art, I suppose. It's the first, certainly, screen, byobu, that comes into an Australian collection. At the time, the Felton Bequest Committee are a bit puzzled by it, but 1907 is the same year that Charles Freer, the other great collector happening in the United States, he's buying a pair of screens by Sotatsu for his eventual museum. So it really is a landmark purchase. Likewise, in 2 years later, 1909, £1,000 being given to Edward Strange, who's written, at the time, had written books about prints. He goes out and finds a collection of 103 Japanese prints coming on the market from John Stewart Happer, and encourages the NGV to purchase them for what was probably the large amount of £547. These weren't, in fact, the first prints. They're still to come as we go to another colony, but they are the best quality collection and the most diverse collection of ukiyo-e prints that come in those very early years into the collection. It's worth noting that, as I said, the first Japanese pieces went into the NGV in 1868. Chinese, actually, they'd started collecting in 1867, so not necessarily the first. But, however, in 1869, I think with the intention of starting up a sort of a technological museum, or the equivalent of the powerhouse that you've got in Sydney now, they had an exhibition, they organised an exhibition of the pieces, the decorative arts pieces across the board, not just Asian by any means, but Asian alongside European, with the view to raising money to put towards this new museum they wanted to build. It never happens, of course, but it calls upon the local gentry of Melbourne to lend their pieces. So John Twycross, you may be familiar with the name, in 2009 his collection of things that he bought at the exhibitions were handed over to Museum Victoria, but actually he was already collecting Japanese pieces, about 30 pieces he'd purchased in London in about 1869, which is a year after the Meiji era has started. So quite extraordinary how certain individuals have got to and become incredibly active in collecting, when in fact there weren't too many outlets happening here. In Victoria, it's worth noting that they were the host of the 1875, the 1880, the 1888 international exhibitions, and yet nothing was donated to the gallery. They had to go out and purchase a few odds and sods, and I find that an interesting sort of comment, that nothing was donated. If I go now to New Zealand, flying top speed here, there are a couple of interesting events happening there. One of them is, in fact, the Governor of New Zealand at the time, Sir George Grey. He was also Governor of South Australia, Governor of South Africa, and he was a great book collector, rather in the mould of Sir Samuel Way. And he in 1887 1887, that date is incorrect. He purchased the books in 1880. 1887, he hands over his book collection to Auckland, what is now the Auckland City Library, and it includes about 50 of these bound pocket books, the Fukuro Toji. So in fact, these are the first books. Up to this point, no books as an art form has entered into any public collection. But the man who takes the prize, in my opinion, is Sir Joseph Kinsey, who is an avid collector. He's coming across to Sydney to buy. He's buying in Christchurch. But in 1914-15, he heads off to Britain, and he's got a great book collection. He's reading books like Sir Samuel Way, but he's extra smart because he goes to dealers. By now there is a proliferation of Japanese art dealers happening throughout Europe and Britain, and in particular he kind of creates a liaison with Miura, who's at Harrogate in Yorkshire, and Miura then advises him on purchases. So on the left-hand side, he's buying what everyone else is doing, the applied arts. And again, if you look into the netsuke, the grazing horse, that is a very common netsuke that keeps popping up through various exhibitions. But he actually embarks upon purchasing kakemono, or the fine arts. And so I find that quite an extraordinary outcome. It goes against the tide of the fashions at the time. And it's not to do with money. It's not that the decorative arts are cheaper and that we're having to pay a fortune for the fine arts. He actually pays £11 for 7 scrolls, which includes a couple of paintings by Hokusai. He pays £33 for a piece of Kwasone by Hayashi. So it is something ingrained that's happening there. In terms of curatorial acumen or expertise or entrepreneurialism, I'm going to give the prize to Bernard Woodward, who in fact knew nothing about art. He started off as a curator of the Geological Museum in Perth and found himself director of the Museum and Art Gallery. He loved the arts and crafts movement, therefore he goes straight to the heart of it. He sends a letter to the Tokyo Imperial Museum requesting that they purchase for him a collection, a Japanese art collection. Either purchase or do an exchange. And the exchange was specimens of marsupials, birds and reptiles for your Japanese art. I think that's quite extraordinary. In the end, he had to pay for them. They obviously didn't want the marsupials, but he did send a stuffed honey anteater off to Japan as a sort of a present. So all the documentation is there, but what is interesting is the role of the Tokyo Imperial Museum, because it's linked to the industrial bureau that's set up by the Meiji government, the Kangyo-ryo, and so they are actually advising all of the producers around, all the potters and ceramicists and the export agents, on the sorts of things that foreigners want. So what they want, give it to them. And so that's the stuff that's coming out to the international exhibitions, and in effect that's what's going into our museums. He was very active. So actually in 1902-1903, Western Australia had effectively the largest Japanese collection, because heaps of ceramics came out. Again, this is really not being documented. I've had to scrabble around to find these pretty images. There's nothing else that's been really documented about this. So there were netsuke, bronzes. There were also 4 paintings by which included Hokusai, Kano and Tosa, and they seem to have evaporated. No one seems to know where they've gone. But in terms of prints, these are the first prints that come into an Australian collection in 1902. The Victorian ones, of course, happened 1909. New South Wales, to finish off, I categorise this under Happenstance. By pure chance, it had been the host of the 1879 Sydney exhibition, and at the end of it, they received a gift of about 75 ceramics, cloisonné, bronzes. Not knowing that they were going to get the gift, the gallery actually had gone out and purchased about 8 objects separately. And so this Cordancia piece, which I think is probably replicated in the print that you can see in the middle of the exhibition image here, is one of those. A lot of them were pairs, and you probably already know that the pairs were broken up in 1925 and they went off to the powerhouse. A couple of years ago, I happened to be in the New South Wales Gallery and was delighted to see that they had put some of the pieces out on display, because the temptation has been, well, they're Meiji, they're hybrid, they've kind of been created for Western taste, they're not pure Japanese, therefore we'll sort of shove them out the back. You can see the Kamiya Company features in the few that they have got there. And then the beautiful sort of Art Nouveau-inspired piece by Miyagawa Kozan. I have to say that's my attribution, because Kozan is listed as having been amongst 3 works by him given to the gallery, and I think this is one of them, but that's just my attribution. There are a couple of others that are not in good condition. And just almost the final, I think, is the fact that amongst those purchases, again, it's not necessarily money that's determining the taste. They buy this pair of very large bronzes, Incense Burners, and they pay £110, which really is a huge amount of money at the time. So, and the final print is that, in effect, this was the big moment for New South Wales. It was basically gifted to them, and they did nothing with it. They dispersed it by handing it off to the Powerhouse Museum, so therefore splitting the pairs. There were a few donations, but really their moment came and they didn't seize it, and it went very quiet. So obviously I'm focusing on the early decades of the 1900s. Clearly something happens mid-century and the whole collecting business starts all over again. Okay, thank you very much.